Have we been lied to about how Christianity began? In these programs, we're exploring the secret Gospels that didn't make it into the Bible. One reason why the 4 Gospels in the Bible were accepted while the others weren't is that these 4 were earlier than the others. So how far back can we trace the Church using these 4 Gospels?
We can go back quite early, I think, to the evidence where these Gospels are being used. Even in the secondary sources that we have, it's difficult to date these sources. So a book like the Didache, most people think came from the first century. And it already is using material that looks very much like it's Matthew's Gospel from the first century. There's even a place where he attributes something to the Gospel, and he quotes something that is almost verbatim from Matthew's Gospel. Also near the end of the first century or the beginning of the second century, we have a lot of echoes. You might not call them quotations in documents like First Clement, the letters of Ignatius, the letter of Polycarp to the Philippians, and the letter of Barnabas, Pseudo-Barnabas. From then on, from right around the beginning years of the second century, you might say that the floodgates start to be open. Early in the life of the Church, there is not always an attribution to these quotations or allusions or paraphrases. As we go along further, we get more attribution. So I would say that we have evidence of these Gospels being used, and not necessarily all of them at the same time, but at least one of the 4 being used even from the end of the first century and into the second.
So who did choose the Gospels?
Christian writers in the second century wouldn't have said that they chose any Gospels. They would have said that they recognized the Gospels that were given. They would have said that they received the ones that were given. Now that may sound like splitting hairs to make those kinds of distinctions, but I think that it made a big difference for them. What's the difference? Well, when you choose something, you are assuming you have the authority to choose. I don't think that they thought they had that authority. They thought they had the responsibility to preserve and to receive what had been given to them. That's the language that they use. Irenaeus uses that language, the Muratorian Fragment uses that language, Justin Martyr uses that language, Clement of Alexandria uses that language. It is that kind of more passive sense of receiving, first of all, what God has given, and then what the apostles of Jesus have handed down to us. In the second century, when we see that already 4 Gospels seem to be distinguished and seem to be associated together, in that period, we don't have any evidence of any church councils that deliberated on this kind of thing. We don't have any evidence of, let's say, a flurry of ecclesiastical correspondence where bishops and teachers were battling it out over which Gospels. What we see is simply something emerging, and something emerging in various parts of the empire. And that's what's one thing that's so impressive to me, is that at least by the second half of the second century, you have a confluence of testimony. You have Irenaeus, who is way out in Gaul, sort of the frontiers of the empire at the time. You have Clement in Alexandria in Egypt. You have Theophilus and Serapion in Antioch in Syria. You have other writers in Asia Minor. And they're all using and talking about these same 4 Gospels. The Gospels that seem to be in everybody's book cabinet, you might say, are the 4. And it's the 4 that are being used in in worship and preaching. As far we know that from Justin Martyr in the middle of the century, and Melito of Sardis, and Irenaeus and Clement. These works are being used in preaching and teaching. It is these same four Gospels that are being combined together in what we know as a gospel harmony. There were at least two gospel harmonies that were constructed in the 2nd century, one by Tatian the Syrian, who was a student of Justin Martyr's, and one by Theophilus of Antioch. But the interesting thing is about these gospel harmonies that they were both trying to harmonize the same four Gospels.
These four Gospels, and only these four, were accepted from an early stage in widely separated places. Church leaders were quoting from the four Gospels in the Bible by the end of the 1st century. The Church didn't choose the Gospels, it recognized the earliest reliable testimony about Jesus. Next time, we'll look at how the evidence of the handwritten copies of the four Gospels compares with the evidence for the secret Gospels.